Hi, everyone. Thanks for hopping on. We're going to wait another minute or two for some more folks to join on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Cinnamon Porter, and my pronouns are she and they. I'm the mission educator for YWCA McLean County. And today we're going to be talking about our immigration system. If you would like, you can open up the group chat and introduce yourself there. And while you all introduce yourself, I'm going to shift to our PowerPoint. So like I said, we're going to be talking about our immigration system. And we're going to talk about a little bit of our history of the US immigration system. We're going to explore some current issues and problems with our immigration system, and then end with some solutions and some next steps, as well as resources. So you can go ahead and turn on your camera if you would like to, or if you are able to. And please mute yourself. If you have a question, you can use the raise hand tool or post it in the chat, and I'll be able to see that and respond as well. And then there will also be time at the end to answer any questions. So before we get started, let's just have some community agreements on how we're going to move forward together. Be present. So this webinar is scheduled for an hour. Hopefully we don't run over a couple minutes, but if we do, just be present and try to soak up as much information as you can. Participate. So if you have any questions, if you want to make a statement, if you need something clarified, please feel free to do so. Active listening. So listen to understand and to learn. Open and honest communication. So please say what's on your mind and on your heart. just making sure that we are respectful as well. And then embracing discomfort. So some of the things that we might talk about might not sit well with you, or you might not quite understand, and that's okay. Just embrace that discomfort, and we can follow up afterwards and chat, or I'll have some resources at the end that you all can continue your education journey. But I wanted to see if you all had any other community agreements that you wanted to add. And if so, you can just unmute yourself and chime in. All right, I see a thumbs up. I appreciate it. Any other thumbs up from you all? Yeah, good, awesome. So as a part of that open and honest communication, I thought that I would ask you all, what has your experience been with the immigration system? So some folks might not have any experience, and there might be folks on this call who have had an experience with the immigration system. So I would like to just give somebody a moment or two if they want to add and share what their experience has been like. Or if folks would like to just, if they have any questions about the immigration system, and maybe we'll answer them now, and then if not, we can try to answer them afterwards as well.
Hi, my name is Veronica. I actually was born in Mexico and I came here to the US. But my dad was already a citizen. So for me, it was easy to navigate the immigration system, and it was kind of like a smooth transition. I know that that is not the case for many other people. You literally have to wait like 20 to 30 years to get your citizenship or even your permanent residency. So yeah, I was just like really lucky, I guess, to be able to get all the papers ready like within a year and a half. But that was just my experience.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica, for sharing. And that seems to be the case, that the immigration system is a little bit easier to navigate when you already have someone here in the US. And you're also right when you say that it can take 20, 30, a lifetime to try to get a visa for the US and eventually gain citizenship. Absolutely. And we'll touch on that later on in the slides. Is there anyone else that would like to add? So someone shared in the post, but that they adopted 3 kids from Russia, and that they ran into a lot of problems and took several years for them to get their citizenship. Yeah, that's also a part of this conversation. I don't touch on it as much, but trying to adopt children from other countries has a lot of obstacles and is also an expensive process as well. Thank you for sharing that. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. So I wanted to start with some definitions or some terms that we hear a lot when we talk about immigration. So can I get a thumbs up, a head nod? Have you all heard these words before when it comes to immigration? Yeah, okay. And so we hear them a lot, and sometimes they get thrown around and we don't really know what the true definition is. So I wanted to go ahead and lay those out for us. So let's start with, an asylum seeker. So an asylum seeker would be a person who is seeking refuge. They're seeking shelter and safety because of the persecution that they face in their home country. So I'll name a couple examples later, but we see folks coming from Venezuela, for example, who are traveling to the US. And the reason why they are leaving their home country is because of the violence that is happening in their home country. And so currently, but if they're an asylum seeker, that means that they are in the US right now. So they would be at one of our border entry points, and they would be saying, hey, I'm coming from this place and I'm here to seek asylum. So an asylum seeker is already here on US territory, which is different from a refugee, because a refugee would be someone who is outside of the US and they are looking to resettle in the United States. So refugee is, I'm still in Venezuela and I want to come to the US. An asylum seeker is, I'm already here in the US. Please take me in. The next one is ICE, which is shortened for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So we hear a lot about ICE when it comes to detaining immigrants and undocumented folks. ICE falls under the Department of Homeland Security. So there's the Department of Homeland Security, and with immigration, they've broken off the responsibilities into three parts. So one is ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's the one that we hear the most about. CIS, which is Citizenship and Immigration Services. And then the third part, which is CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection. The next one is deportation. So that is the removal of a non-citizen and undocumented person from the United States. So people can be deported even if they are lawful permanent residents, but if they have a criminal conviction, someone who can be deported if they overstay their visa, a refugee or asylum seeker, and then those who have entered what they say unlawfully. So they haven't gone through the proper channels to enter the United States. The next term is detention, prisons, and jails. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth on another slide. But we see, and especially recently in the past year or so, conversations in the national media about ICE detentions and detention centers. But I think it's important that we call them what they are, which is, it's not just a detention center. These are detention prisons and jails, and that's the way they're meant to operate. That's the way they look like, and they serve a certain purpose. And so, like I said, we'll go more into that later on. But this is the United States government practice of incarcerating people while they wait for a decision on their immigration case. And then the last one is naturalization. So naturalization is the process to become a United States citizen if you were born outside of the US. Or also if you are if your parents are undocumented and you were born on the US soil. So if you meet certain requirements, then you can become a US citizen either at birth or after birth. So those are some definitions, and we'll see them a lot through the next couple of slides, but there might be some other words that you all would like to be defined. Just let me know. But before I move to the next slide, are there any questions? Awesome. So I want to move into a history of our immigration system, and this overview is brief. It is very general. We could go a lot more in depth about, we could spend a lot of webinars about just our immigration history, but I did want to highlight some standouts when it comes to our immigration system. And so where I will begin is our Immigration Act of 1882. There were a couple of immigration acts before that, but this is really seen as the first general immigration law. And so that's because, one, they decided to create a head tax for immigrants. So if you immigrated to the US, they would tax you when you came onto US soil. And those taxes were used to fund enforcement and basically create a segment of our government that would be dedicated to immigration. And then the second reason that it's seen as a real staple in terms of immigration is because it restricted certain classes of people from immigrating into the United States. And so this happened in 1882. So that's kind of our starting point. However, in that same year, and I think it ties in very well with why it's seen as a staple as an immigration act, is because we said that it restricted certain types of people from coming into the US. Well, guess what happened in 1882? We have the Chinese Exclusion Act. Has anyone ever heard of that before? Yeah, so in the same year, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which restricted Chinese laborers and did not allow for Chinese people to be naturalized, meaning they could not become citizens. And so we see this as the start of illegal immigration. One thing to note about the Chinese Exclusion Act is, and if you've seen some of these other webinars when we're talking about privilege and oppression, this is a clearly racist immigration act. And this is not the last time that we will see this when we go through this overview, but it is true to the US that we see racism, and in some of these other immigration acts, we not only see racism, but we also see ableism. We also see heterosexism. We see xenophobia. We see classism. And so once I go through all of these, I want to see what your takeaways are from these overviews of our immigration system. So that's 1882. We're going to move forward a little bit to the Naturalization Act of 1906. And so what this did was standardize our naturalization procedures. Part of that included that folks who were trying to immigrate to the United States needed to have some sort of knowledge of the English language. That was a requirement for them to gain citizenship. After that, we moved to 1917, and what we did was restrict immigration from Asia. So not just one country, but the whole continent, and introduced a reading test to gain citizenship. So not only did you have to have knowledge of English language, but you also had to be able to read English to gain citizenship. And that sounds very familiar when we think about Jim Crow, which we see, later on. We move to 1924. We begin a national origin quota system. And we'll talk about the quota system and what that means, but basically it means each country can only have a certain number of people immigrate to the United States in a year. We'll talk about that more later. In the 1930s, we have federal officials deporting more than 400,000 Mexican folks. And so I think it's important to bring that up because when we think about immigration and how we've expanded as a country, we crossed Mexican borders, right? They didn't cross us. We really crossed over their borders. And I'll have a picture on the next slide that just shows what was Mexico before the Mexican-American War, and then you'll see how much we really took up. And then in 1943, so this is 60 years later, so we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. 60 years later, we finally repeal that act. That's a good thing. But then from 1942 to 1945 is World War II. And so what we see happening is that Japanese people on the West Coast are being forced into internment camps. So this is another part of our immigration system. So about 127,000 people were placed in these internment camps. And they were placed there out of fear, which to me is a nicer way of saying out of racism, right? And then next on the slide, you see 1954, which is Operation Wetback. And yes, don't say that term because that is a very racist term against Mexican folks and Latino folks. But this is when the United States government deported immigrants in areas around the West Coast. So California, Arizona, and Texas. And that'll make sense when I show you this next image. But more than 1.3 million people were deported, or they left out of fear of deportation, out of threat of deportation. Yeah. And then finally, and kind of the last thing that we've seen in terms of updates to our immigration system is the Immigration Act of 1990. And so that lowered the admittance, like the amount of people that we would admit to the United States to 675,000. So we are lowering the number of immigrants that we'll allow into our United States. The only upside was that we decided that we could allow gay people to immigrate into the United States. So that's good. But that's 1990. It is now 2020. So 30 years later, there hasn't been much of an update to our immigration system. And that's a problem, right? One of the problems is our country has grown exponentially. It's grown by a third. And not only that, but we have more and more immigrants in our community, which means that we need to protect them, right? They need to have rights. And we are not updating our laws to be in suit with what is reality. So I'm just gonna take a quick pause right there. But what did you hear? What are some of the takeaways that you have from, I mean, this is just a brief overview. In brief, I mean, I spent like 10 minutes going through it, but what are some takeaways that you have? You can either post in the chat or you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Y'all don't have any thoughts? Oh, Tony's got some thoughts. Okay. I see someone posted the US has been keeping groups of people out since the beginning. It's not something new. Absolutely. And we see those tactics evolve, but absolutely. And it's unfortunate that what we all consider to be the United States, a melting pot, right? Immigrants are welcome. They should be here. How much they provide to our country, or a necessity to our country, tend to hurt specific types of immigrants, and who it hurts changes over time. Absolutely. Although there's been some changes, it really doesn't give much a difference. Yeah. Someone asked, or someone said, I think what you laid out defies the melting pot affirmation fallacy, which I agree, right? We're told one thing, which is we're a melting pot. We should all come together. We're all good in community, except here are all these laws that are not going to allow you in. And we'll talk about some current examples, but absolutely. Someone said, what about the Statue of Liberty? That is a good question. And I recently just read something about the Statue of Liberty. And if I can find it before this webinar is over, I will post it in the chat box. But what I thought I knew to be true about the Statue of Liberty wasn't 100% the truth. So that's what I'll say right now until I can find what it was that I read. But thank you for that question, and I'll try to answer that too. Or we can follow up afterwards as well. So I had mentioned to you while we were talking about the history of these laws, how the United States took over the borders of Mexico. So I wanted to show you all this image really quick because it's one that it really just takes me. So if you see at the top of the image, that's where, you know, Canada would be. So we've got just all of this space that was Mexico. And you can even see there where would be Texas, New Mexico, California, what other states? Nevada, Utah, and a little part of Kansas, Wyoming. That was all Mexico. But then we know what it looks like now, right? Which is you got to drop down a lot. And there's a lot of things that led up to the reshaping of the border. And that's some stuff that y'all could look up, because that could be a whole nother webinar as well. But it is interesting to look at what were the borders before and what do they look like now. So I stated earlier that we've got some problems with our immigration system. And I've laid out 4 problems that we have, but there are a lot more than 4. And yeah, there are a lot more than 4 problems. But what I'm going to do is just touch on these 4 problems and just try to get a conversation started about what are some of the issues with our immigration system and what can we do about it. So I'm going to show you all a 1-minute clip on what are some of our problems.
The United States has an immigration system that hasn't changed much since the 1960s. However, the number of immigrants has grown from 5 million to nearly 44 million. According to the think tank Migration Policy Institute, nearly 30% are unauthorized immigrants, and most of them have been here for at least a decade. So why don't they just get in line, you may ask? Well, one reason, for most unauthorized immigrants, there is no line. If you don't have an immediate family member here with permanent status, getting a green card is really hard. You could try immigrating through your work or profession, but visas are really limited, and even more so for low-skilled jobs. You can also apply for humanitarian protection, but the U.S. caps the number of refugees, and the asylum process is extremely complex and stringent. Or you can try to win a visa in a lottery system, but good luck with that. While some government officials claim unauthorized immigrants are flooding into the U.S., the fact is illegal border crossings hit a 46-year low after the election of Donald Trump. The president's aggressive approach to immigration enforcement may be having a short-term effect, but may not do much in the long run.
Also, on immigration, you should check out some of her other videos, because I kind of just went into a rabbit hole watching some videos about immigration by her, and they were very easy to understand. So let me add that to the chat real quick. All right. So that was just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. But as she mentioned in the videos, what are some of our problems? It is about quotas. It is about wait times. I wanted to talk a little bit about the DACA program, and then also the immigrant detention centers. So when we look at, let me go back one. So when we look at our immigration system, as many of you has pointed out, and as we've seen through that brief overview of the history of our laws, our system is flawed, and honestly, I think it's broken. And so our system is set up in a way to be restrictive. And so when we talk about quotas, for example, these quota numbers haven't changed since 1990. The honest truth is, I wasn't even born then. So that is mind-blowing to me that I've lived a whole lifetime, and yet there has been no change. And because there's been no change when it comes to letting folks immigrate into our country, that creates a backlog, which just means that there are millions of people waiting. And as someone mentioned earlier, they're waiting 10, 20, 30 years just to gain citizenship into our country. And we've got to do better, and we can do better. When we think about DACA, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, but we're talking about kids, 0 to 6, 0 to 10, who are being brought here to the US, who don't know any other country but this one, and then are being deported to a country they've never known, right? And there are a lot of repercussions in doing that, and that doesn't seem like a fair system. There seems like there's a way that we could work these things out, a way to create a path to citizenship for children who are innocent in them being brought here, but they should be able to continue to have a life here in the US. And then when it comes to the immigration detention centers, immigrants are being detained, and there's really no end in sight, at least at this point. But in these immigrant prisons and jails, they are experiencing inhumane treatment. And we'll talk about one example that just came out actually this week, or well, within this last week, of women who were being forcibly sterilized. So against their will, they were being sterilized. And that's not right. And yeah, we'll get into it in a minute. let's start with the quota system. So quotas, basically what that means is that we just set a set number of people from a country that can immigrate into the United States every year. And so in total, the US can grant up to 675,000 permanent visas a year. And then after 5 years, you can apply for citizenship. No country can receive more than 7% of the total visas issued a year. So what that means is no country can receive more than 7% of the visas issued that year, which leads to certain countries like Mexico, India, China, and the Philippines that have a much longer wait than other countries, because there's more people from those countries who are applying for visas. So that, again, one, leads to a backlog and a wait time that we'll talk about, but two, isn't very fair, right? We should be able to be flexible and be able to adjust, and a 7%, almost like a flat tax, you know, it seems like we could adjust what our numbers are. And so one of the countries that I mentioned, India, they averaged the longest wait time. And this is just an average. So it was about 9 years that they had to wait to receive a visa. That is a very long time. And something I read earlier was that in 2013, the US courts rejected 97% of asylum requests from India. So not only do you have to wait 9 years, if you try to seek asylum from India, 97% of the time, they're gonna tell you no. And if I had those kind of odds, I don't know that I would even try. But that's not right. And like I said, I think we could adjust the current system that we have right now. Looking at wait times. In 2018, there were roughly 5 million people waiting in the applicant backlog. 5 million people. So that means in the past few years, that number has only grown. And those people are waiting 9, 10, 20 years to get a visa or get citizenship. And this is caused by the quotas that we have. So if we say only a certain number of people from your country can come, right, a certain percentage, and then all these other folks, you just have to keep waiting, right? That's how that backlog builds. Another example is siblings from of US citizens from Mexico and the Philippines waited 2 decades to receive visas. Again, that's a long time. And it seems unnecessary. But this is one of the reasons why, and one of the biggest concerns that people are advocating for immigration reform, because these quotas and these wait times don't reflect our reality, right? We have booming industry that we could use folks in. People should be able to be here and spend time with their family, right? But we also noticed that there was a trend of keeping certain types of people out of our country. And that's just not right. All right, DACA. Have you all heard of DACA before? I'm sure a lot of folks have. So DACA is short for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And basically what that means is this program allows some individuals who were brought here as children to receive a 2-year period of deferred action from deportation. So meaning, okay, if you apply for DACA and you get it, that grants you 2 more years without, well, hopefully without fear of deportation, but we've seen examples where that's just not the case. But then also if you receive DACA, you can be eligible for a work visa or work permit. And I have an infographic on it on the next slide as well. But this was passed by President Obama in 2012. The downside of DACA is that it doesn't provide a pathway to citizenship. So it allows you a pathway to a work permit, but there's a lot of other steps that have to come for you to get that work permit. You have to apply to a place who has applied to be able to hire someone hire someone who's an immigrant for a work permit. And then you might not get it. And those are also very selective as well. Versus there is an act called the DREAM Act or the Dreamers Act that was trying to be passed. And actually our own Senator Dick Durbin was a co-sponsor on that. And that would do these same things, but also provide a pathway to citizenship. So it extended DACA even further. And so currently in the US, we have about 700,000 active recipients of DACA. And I remember a few years back, this was 2017, I believe, that our current administration was trying to repeal DACA. So take away this program or try to reduce it as much as they could. And so being here in Bloomington Normal and the couple of university and colleges that we have, I knew folks who were DACA recipients, and they were extremely fearful because I'll go to the next slide, but what we see is that the average age of these DACA recipients or dreamers, they were 6 when they arrived here, right? I don't know if I have any memories before 6. So they are coming to a country and this is all they know. And now they fear deportation to a place that they don't know. And not just that, but we'll talk about what is it like to be detained. And that is a scary process as well. So that started happening in 2017. And then in 2018, repealing back some of DACA was upheld by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision. And what happened after that was we saw people who were lawfully allowed to be here being detained and rounded up by ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so that put a lot of fear in a lot of people, which was unfair. And so looking at the dreamers in DACA, their average age is 26. 91% of them are employed. I don't know that we can say that about other 26-year-olds, right? 91% of them are employed. And not only that, but 100% have no criminal record. And I think that's important to note because sometimes we hear, well, we don't want these folks to stay here because they are criminals. They're going to do illegal things. But in order to be a recipient, you cannot have a criminal record. And if you ever get one, then you, your DACA status is revoked. So these people are working out here hard and, you know, doing the right thing. So as this infographic says, like, why deport people who have lived here their entire lives and contribute to our economy and they enrich our community? The last part of the immigration system that I want to talk about is our detention centers, detention prisons. And I know that this has been another central point in our media recently as well. So approximately 85,000 people are being held in these detention jails. And that's just what is documented. Because unfortunately, along with these detention centers, we see that they are, quote unquote, losing kids. And we could have a whole nother talk about that, but they're saying there's about 85,000 people being held, but I imagine that this is a low number. These detention centers are gravely overcrowded. They are unsanitary. People don't have access to showers. They don't have access to toothpaste. Kids are being held in these detention centers. Out of that 85,000, 11,000 are kids. So that means babies don't have wash bottles, they don't have diapers. Little kids are having to take care of even smaller kids. So an 11 to 10-year-old is having to take care of an infant. In these centers, they are not given much. We've seen those, oh, and I forgot the word now, but those shiny, like silver blankets. And that's because there are extreme cold temperatures in these centers. They leave the lights on for 24 hours a day. And this is all information coming from testimonies of people who have been in these detention centers. I'll show some images on the next slide, but children are sleeping on the floor, or it's so overcrowded that everybody just has to stand. There's not enough room to let folks lay on the floor. We've also seen coming out of these detention prisons is cases of physical abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse, and none of these things are all right. And these are not things that we should be okay with happening in the United States and at the hands of our government. There was a report from the Department of Homeland Security that they went into one center and 900 people were crammed into a space where it was only meant to hold 125 people. 900 people crammed into a space that was only meant for 125 people. And the thing that just came out within this last week is that one of the detention jails in Georgia, there was a whistleblower, her name was Dawn, and I forget her last name, but she came forward and said that they were sterilizing women against their will. And that also has relevance to our history as the United States. We've seen that happen time and time again to Black women and to Latina women. And yeah, that is forcibly sterilizing someone is a human rights violation. So we've got countries who are calling on the US to stop these practices. And people outside of the US are outraged. And I think that we all should be as well. And so a lot of the people that are in these detention prisons are people who were asylum seekers or who are asylum seekers. They are fleeing countries where they are in imminent harm. So a lot of folks are from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So if those things weren't bad enough, at the beginning of this year, we have COVID-19, right? And it's been hard enough to try to stay as safe as I can, right? In this community, and we've seen, you know, what the numbers have looked like, especially recently, but there is no way that you can stop COVID-19 in a detention center. And so there have been calls, and I'll mention this later again, but calls to make sure that these folks who are being detained have access to the necessary, you know, protective equipment and things like that. But as well as when we're passing these bills to protect people for COVID, that we include immigrants, because right now, some of our bills are not including immigrants in that protection. So I'm gonna move on to, it's like 3 pictures of what these detention centers look like. Just as a warning, they are not a good sight. So yeah. So if you look up on the top left, people are, I mean, nobody has any personal space. In all photos, you can see nobody has any personal space. You look at the one on the top right, these photos remind me of images of what slave ships look like, how they would stack people next to each other, next to each other, next to each other, next to each other. There's nowhere for you to go. And then if you look at, so those two are inside, but we have seen some of these detention centers have started to spill outside, which is that last image. Yeah, I don't have much to say. I think these photos speak for themselves. But I wanted to give y'all a chance to react and just share how you feel looking at these images. So as before, you can share them in the chat or you can unmute yourself. Someone said subhuman living conditions. Absolutely. Some other folks shared, this is just sickening. Can't believe that this is happening in the US. That our dog kennels look better than these detention centers. And that this is horrible and that this should not be allowed. And so that's part of our next steps is we can stop this, right? We have people power. We can stop this. So how can we help? Reach out to your representatives, okay? So our Congress people, our senators or representatives, all the way from the federal down to state, down to local. Reach out to them and let them know what you want to see done. right? Let them know that this is not okay with you, their constituent. I will share some resources in the next slide. And if you go to these websites, they have some initiatives that they're working on, some bills that can be passed, some ways that we can make a change. So check out these sites and relay that information to your representatives. So that's kind of on a big scale, but then even here locally, and let's see, this was probably 2 years ago, so 2017 or so, there was a call to have a welcoming cities ordinance in both Bloomington and Normal. And so what a welcoming city is that it basically says that Bloomington or Normal, we want to reaffirm to our immigrant community and immigrant people that our cities and our towns value them, and that we want to strengthen our relationship with them. And that includes ensuring that police and city officials are not aiding the federal government in detainment. So a welcoming city would be that we say to the immigrant community, we support you and we appreciate you. We want to strengthen the ties and the relationship of our local governments with law enforcement, because one point of conversation with the Welcoming Cities Ordinance was that immigrants and undocumented folks are sometimes afraid to call on law enforcement when they are being harmed, because they have to make the choice of, do I call and try to get help from law enforcement? But if I call, am I going to be detained and am I going to be deported? And that's not right, and that's not a choice that they should have to make. So someone who has been sexually assaulted shouldn't have to choose between getting justice and the fear of deportation. So there has been a revival for a push for a Welcoming Cities Ordinance. I know WGLT and I think the Pentagraph and maybe some other places just posted some stories from a rally that happened this week, so go ahead and check those out. Other ways that we can help is by continuing education, because this conversation barely scratched the surface. There is so much to our immigration system. It is complex. It is hard to understand, and there are so many moving pieces to our immigration system. So if this sparked anything in you, I encourage you to go out and continue learning about our immigration system. And then lastly, trying to connect with your local immigrant community. We have a lot of different types of immigrant communities here in McLean County. They have different festivals, cook-offs, celebrations. Get connected, support them in any way that you can. And then looking at some resources here locally, we have the Immigration Project, and I cannot recommend them enough. The Immigration Project is really doing good work. So if you have questions about the immigration system, if you or someone you know needs resources, needs help, reach out to the Immigration Project. And again, that is here locally. So they're a great place to reach out to. On a larger level, we have the National Immigrant Justice Center. So they have some campaigns, as well as a lot of resources. And then we have the Immigration Justice Campaign. They also have some action steps for you all to take. There was a lot of good research and resources on the Migration Policy Institute. So if you are a numbers person, a data person, that was the place to be. Yeah, I got lost in all the numbers there because there was just so much information. And then finally, the ACLU. They are always doing good work when it comes to immigration. So definitely check out the ACLU, and that's the American Civil Liberties Union. So that's what I have for you all. So are there any questions? You can either post them in the chat or unmute yourself. And while you're thinking of them or typing them, I'm going to put up my contact information. So if you don't feel comfortable sharing here, or if you want to talk offline, again, my name is Cinnamon Porter, and there's my email below, cporter@ywcamclean.org. As well as if you want additional trainings or webinars, if you have idea for something that you would like to see the YWCA talk about, go ahead and reach out to me. And I appreciate you all for attending this webinar, and I'll leave this up for a minute or two or see if anyone has any questions, but that's all I've got for you all. So thank you all for joining me in this webinar.